The image you are currently seeing, It's Okay to Leave the Plantation, is a book by author Mason Weaver, who's also a motivational speaker and businessman. Today we're going to talk about black slave owners. Many historians have argued that the majority of black masters purchased their relatives and friends who were held in bondage. Being unable to manumit their loved ones, the black masters were forced to hold their kinsfolk and friends as nominal slaves. So they treated their relatives and friends as free persons, and whenever possible, they attempted to manumit their loved ones. Thus, the dominant pattern of slaveholding that developed among free blacks was benevolent and based primarily on kinship. Even though black slave owners usually demonstrated benevolent behavior toward their slave relations and friends, a commercial or materialistic exchange existed between them and their slaves purchased as investments. In fact, the free blacks who maintained a dual relationship with their slaves had no universal commitment against slavery. To them, slavery was an impressive institution when it affected a beloved relative or a trusted friend, but beyond that realm, slavery was viewed as a profit-made institution to be exploited. In many instances, free black slave owners shared a similar view of slavery with their white counterparts. Slave owners of both races occasionally manumitted a trusted servant and in the same moment requested the sale of another slave. The act of freeing one or several slaves while others remained in bondage did not constitute a firm commitment against slavery, but a personal view which acknowledged that some slaves, through merit or hard work, deserved their freedom, while others were destined to be slaves until death. So when philanthropic free blacks purchased slaves and then emancipated them, they were not always paternalistic owners, as Carter G. Woodson suggested. For example, Richard Holloway Sr., a free black of Charleston City, bought a slave named Charles Benford in order that the slave might enjoy his freedom. Yet at the same time, he owned other slaves who were not treated so kindly. In 1834, for instance, he purchased a Negro woman named Sarah and her two children, Annette and Edward, from Susan B. Robertson for $575. Within 3 years after the purchase, he apparently became dissatisfied with the slave family and sold them for $945. Even though Richard Holloway Sr. allowed a trusted servant to enjoy a greater degree of freedom, he was still a slave owner for profit. So he sold and purchased slaves as an investment, even while he held other slaves for benevolent reasons. To consider him a benevolent master would be erroneous because he also exploited other slaves for his own benefit. Many black masters were firmly committed to the chattel slavery and saw no reasons for manumitting their slaves. To those colored masters, slaves were merely property to be purchased, sold, or exchanged. Their economic self-interest overrode whatever moral concerns or guilt they may have harbored about slavery. Since the black masters benefited from slavery, they rationalized that because the institution was profitable, they could not relinquish their valuable property without being reimbursed. So black masters continued to own slaves even when the Union Army was preparing to invade South Carolina in 1864. The commercial impulse of black masters to exploit the commodity of slave property was recorded not only by the Secretary of State, but the Master of Equity in Charleston District. In scores of reports, the black masters appear to have used their slaves as commodities. George Shrewsbury and James Hanscom, both colored slave masters, argued over the ownership of 3 slaves in a court of equity. Rather than sue each other, they filed a complaint against the master of the workhouse because he refused to release the slaves to either of the men until the ownership of the slaves was established. In 1845, the 2 colored slave owners filed a suit against the master of the workhouse and claimed that he refused to release their property. The commercial impulses of both colored men are vividly illustrated by the court proceeding. Such cases are not isolated incidents. In fact, they are prevalent in the court records. For example, there were mortgages registered by free blacks who used their slaves as collateral to secure loans. In 1811, Phyllis Wells, a free colored woman of Charleston City, used her servant Mark as collateral to obtain a loan from Peter Desportes for $900. In 1823, a slave named Sarah was used as security by William Aiken, a free black and carpenter of Charleston City, when he applied for a loan from Joseph S. Brown for $600. The black masters who were not related to their slaves by ties of kinship were not personally disturbed when default and seizure occurred. In December 1841, John S. Mark, a barber of Charleston City, bought a Negro man named Billy and his wife, Pravi, from Otto Cook for $420. 2 years later, he obtained a loan from George Shrewsbury for $300. To secure the loan, he mortgaged Billy and Pravy. Shortly thereafter, John St. Mark apparently defaulted on the loan and sold the slaves Billy and Pravy for $375. Most of the black women who conveyed their slaves in marriage settlements were not related to slaves by kinship. Thus, their slaves were primarily viewed as commodity. For example, shortly after the marriage settlement of Hannah Norman Miles, she sold her servant woman Lucy, who was part of the chattel in her marriage contract, for 35 pounds sterling. When a bond of kinship has been eliminated from the slaveholding of free blacks, the commercial element becomes a strong motive. Consequently, the colored women who established marriage settlements viewed their slaves as investments to be utilized. In the marriage contract of Claudia Angelina English, the daughter of a colored slave owner Barbara from Charleston City, she held 1/5 interest in 3 slaves named Lindy, James, and George. By and large, slaves conveyed in marriage contracts were seen as property by their colored owners. The probate records also demonstrated the commercial motives of black slaveholding in South Carolina. In scores of wills, black slave masters used their human chattel as commercial assets, requesting that their slaves should be auctioned to the highest bidder for payment of their debts or for the benefit of family members. In 1820, Benjamin Lincoln, a free black and tailor of Charleston City, instructed his executors to sell my Negro woman slave feathers and for the proceeds thereof to pay my just deeds. Abraham Jackson, an ex-slave from St. Paul's Parish, stipulated that my Negro woman by the name Sarah be immediately set free from all servitude. However, Jackson did not emancipate the children of the slave woman, but requested that they be disposed of as my executive shall judge proper. Indeed, even as the colored masters were making their deathbed testaments, the commercial bond of slavery permeated their dying demands. To them, slavery remained an economic system to be exploited. Clearly, the bond of kinship compelled the colored slaveholders to inform their executors that their loved ones were not chattel to be humiliated and dehumanized by appraising them at the level of horses, cattle, and swine, narrowed to the impersonal medium of gold and silver. Yet the colored masters who were not related to their servants were not restrained from considering their slaves a chattel. Consequently, when the executors of the commercial masters had their inventories, those slaves were appraised just like cattle and pigs. The commercial impulse of black slaveholding can be examined nowhere better than Charleston City. In the port city, the environment was conducive to black slaveholding. The urban setting of Charleston provided many free blacks with the economic opportunity to prosper. In fact, free blacks nearly monopolized such work as barbering, bricklaying, shoemaking, and tailoring. Once the black entrepreneurs were able to establish themselves and had developed a clientele, they began to prosper and eventually earn the capital needed to invest in slaves. So it was quite common for free black artisans to purchase slaves and use them in their businesses. In 1822, Moses Brown, a colored barber, purchased a Negro boy named Moses from Mary Warham for $300. Since Moses Brown was a barber, he instructed his slave in the art of cutting hair. By 1823, the slave boy was working in his master's shop on 5 Tradd Street. Also in 1829, Camilla Johnson, a colored pastry cook, purchased a mulatto woman named Diana Todd, who was 18 years old, from Joseph and Ann Wilkie for $375. According to a Charleston socialite, Camilla Johnson used her mulatto servant to work at several of the parties she was hired to cater. As these black artisans began to prosper, they were able to utilize the services of slaves, and so they invested in human chattel and trained their servants in the skills of their trade to increase the profits of their businesses. When black masters exploited their slaves for commercial purposes, they encountered the same problems which perplexed many white slave owners. Regardless of the color of the slave masters, the oppressive nature of slavery was met with opposition from the slaves. Many black masters were faced with the dilemma of controlling their slaves when they exploited the labor of their servants. The black masters believed that punishment was a necessary instrument to control their slaves and preserve a sense of authority. Like white slave owners, the black masters placed disobedient slaves in the city jail or the workhouse and contemplated further punishment for their servants. In 1851, Elizabeth Collins Holloway, a colored woman, placed her servant Celia in the city jail after a slave had run away. In 1852, Holloway's servant Peggy was confined in a workhouse for disciplinary reasons. Such a confinement usually lasted from 5 to 30 days, depending upon the disposition of the slave master. After the slaves were released from the workhouse, it was not unusual for their masters to give them a flogging for their disobedience. By and large, The commercial impulse of black masters to exploit their slaves was quite apparent in Charleston City. Many slave owners of African descent used the labor of slaves for their own benefit. Yet the exploitation of slave labor was not always a smooth process, because the slaves of black masters attempted to assert their own rights to freedom by resisting their owners.